My name is Joan Ruggiero. I'm the president of the Law Enforcement Intelligence Club that helped to host this film tonight with the Taylor Little Theater. I would first like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I know the weather's quite difficult to travel. I'm just going to briefly introduce each of our panelists tonight before we begin. Our first speaker will be Dr. James Breckenridge. Dr. Breckenridge is the Executive Director of the Institute for Intelligence Studies here at Mercyhurst. During his military career, his leadership responsibilities range from commanding the U.S. Army's first unit to engage in combat to serving as a professor of military science in which he taught Middle Eastern history at the Military Academy at West Point. Tonight he will be providing the background information leading up to the Iran hostage crisis, which will provide context for other panelists to comment. Following Dr. Breckenridge will be Professor Art Mills. Professor Mills served as a U.S. Department of State's Foreign Service Officer for 22 years with overseas postings in Latin America, Africa, Europe, and South Asia. He was also a specialized terrorism analyst for the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Professor Mills will discuss the role of the State Department and the function of embassies today and during the situations presented in the film. Our final panelist will be former Chief of Overseas Operations for the CIA, David Martine. Professor Martine's career with the CIA began in 1982, in which he was stationed in areas of the Far East and the Middle East. His duties as chief included oversight of covert operations, security counterintelligence interviews, and behavioral assessments of target agents. He has been personally exfiltrated twice in his career and is very familiar with Iran's intelligence capabilities during the 1980s. Professor Martine will share his experiences with Iranian intelligence and how the movie Argo fits into exfiltration efforts. So, without further ado, I will hand the microphone off and we'll begin.
Well, good. Thanks for coming out on this wintry night. If we keep it too long, we'll probably have a second hostage crisis. At least not for 444 days. What we're going to do tonight, in terms of just we'll have sort of a quick sketch and perspective, at least from a historical standpoint, and then Art will talk about his particular experience in this as a embassy officer, and then followed by Dave Martine. And then we'd like to just open it up for questions, because I'm sure you have some questions around what you saw and also our particular take on it. But just real quickly, in terms of the history, I realized the first part of this audience right up front, 1979 is a long time ago, and so to sort of put that in perspective, that's probably the key year in terms of Middle Eastern history over the last 60 or 70 years. A lot happened, and what you don't see in the film is that the President of the United States really had to deal not only with this hostage crisis, but if you saw towards the end of that, we had the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, we had the storming of the mosque in Saudi Arabia, we had to take in the American embassy in Islamabad, we had an ongoing civil war in Lebanon. And it looked as if there would be another Arab-Israeli war on the horizon. So the world, as we knew it in the Middle East, was about to blow sky high. And so that was sort of the context. The other part of that was that later in the year, Saddam Hussein would invade Iran from Iraq, and that would precipitate a whole series of events leading up to today. So a lot of what occurred in 1979, at least for the younger part of the audience, we're still dealing with right now. But this was a good news story, followed by, to a degree, a bad news story, which was the failure of Desert One, what we call Eagle Claw, in April of that year. So as soon as these hostages were evacuated, that was followed by an attempt to rescue the rest of the hostages that failed. The good part about that was that our Special Operations Command evolved from that. And so it's the adept, proficient, highly skilled force that you see today as a direct result of that failure. So in terms of history here, a lot was going on, and some really interesting sort of things that lead us to some improvements today, but also wrestling with still the legacy of the Shah. We're still dealing with an Iranian situation that may get even worse this year. So even after 32 years, 33 years of this, we're still going to wrestle with a perception on the part of the clerical leader in Iran that the great Satan is amiss. So this was fun tonight, but just remember there's some sobering things going on out there too that we'll have to wrestle with. One of the things that is asked about this film was, is that chase scene towards the end what really happened? And it was good Hollywood, wasn't it? I mean, it kept you on the edge of the seat. But I think if you dive into the history, you're going to find something else. But those of you who watched the Golden Globe Awards, if you had a chance to see them, Ben Affleck actually brought Tony Mendez into the award show, so he's still alive and kicking out there and doing well. But I'll leave it at that. I'll let Art take over from here and talk a little bit about his experience.
Okay, this is, yeah, all right, I'm working now. I always like to look at these movies because I realize I am history now. And I had forgotten about late Led Zeppelin, and that was a nice little touch, and that was really good. But I served with a number of the people here. A couple of them were more than associates, even friends. And Bruce Langen, who was the charge in charge of what was left of the embassy at that time, became quite well known in my time in the State Department. Most Americans don't understand the role of the embassy, and one of the things you might look at and say, why were these people still there? Well, those of you who have been overseas and have had contacts with the embassy, usually you don't do this unless you are in trouble. And so much of what remained in the embassy was the bare reporting staff and the consular people. And the consular officers, who were the ones that escaped, were the ones that are not only the visa people, but also responsible for the welfare of American citizens abroad. It's our statutory responsibility. One might ask, how did we in the State Department get in this situation that led to the hostage crisis? A little backstory here is early in February, actually on Valentine's Day, the embassy had been stormed once already. Very similar to what happened here, they broke in, the Marines had to retreat to the second floor, used tear gas. At that time, the Iranian government responded and cleared the embassy compound. So at that point, that was a wake-up call to the American government, and the embassy staff was reduced to the absolute minimum. There was no dependents, all family members had been removed, so we only had the bare staff that had been at one time, as Jim pointed out to me, the largest embassy as far as number of Americans in the world at one time. This was a unique situation, and what we call in intelligence, to a certain extent, mirror imaging. We believed that this was a government that would act despite whatever kinds of disputes it had with the United States under accepted international norms. And that is the inviolability of diplomatic property and the inviolability of diplomats abroad. That was a mistake. We could not foresee what had happened. We had never, and I tried to look into this to see about the evacuation of an embassy under duress. And the only one I could come up with was the evacuation from Saigon, which I also lived through, in a way. But even that, one could at least rationalize that as a result of breakdown of war. You noted that there were only 66 people there. Again, Marine security guards. Some of you may understand the role of a Marine security guard is not to protect American personnel. It is to allow enough time to destroy classified material. That's the only reason the Marines are there. Not to protect you, not to protect a building there, give you enough time to burn. Now, of the two events in the last 25 years, I think that have been most influential in governing the way the State Department operates overseas, this was the first. It showed us how vulnerable we could be, and that's a great shot in that first part of the recreation of the embassy. You see where that embassy is right on the street, completely open, completely vulnerable. Since that time, fortunately or unfortunately, as one may view it because of a diplomat's actual job, we have turned our embassies into fortresses. This in itself causes some problems, not only with our host countries, but also with the fact that a diplomat's job is to get out, to report, to learn about what's going on in the country. And this has been, it was the first of those incidents which no longer allows diplomats the freedom of action that they once had. The second one was later than this, but it was Lockerbie, the bombing of Lockerbie, whereby we increased our commitment to informing and trying to protect American citizens overseas. I'm an old guy now, and I sound like the people that, when I came into the Foreign Service, that said, this is not this way the Foreign Service used to be. You know, it used to be much better and that. And I can say that now for my colleagues who are still serving, including a very dear friend of mine who is in Egypt at this moment, it is not the Foreign Service that I remember. It's very difficult. It's a demanding and trying and taxing job for your State Department representatives. I still identify to a certain extent with this. We don't really expect American people to understand what they do, what we do. It's very hard to explain. You can't go visit an embassy and expect to be amazed because it's a big office building. But rest assured that your diplomats are working night and day the best they can to protect the interests of the United States government and to protect individual Americans to the best of their ability. I just have one more thing to say. I watched this whole thing, and we had the proper obeisance to Canada at the end, but it seemed to me to be a kind of afterthought. Ambassador Ken Taylor plays a role there, but it's more of a passive role. The CIA sort of comes front and center. I would like you all to appreciate what our Canadian friends did for us in this instance. From the very beginning, when they knew that they could help, there was no hesitation. As to the best of my knowledge, no political debate in Canada. It was a decision done and made on our behalf to help. And I brought my little cheat sheet here only to read you something. At the time, Prime Minister Joe Clark when this was all done, he said at an anniversary celebration of this, he said, cooperation during this period demonstrates the close and quite fundamental bond between Canada and the United States, despite our many and serious differences on other issues. And that is true. I have served with Canadian colleagues in many places in the world. Despite what differences our governments might have, they were also always warm and welcoming, and we had many, many deep and endearing Canadian friends. And for this, I applaud them. Ken Taylor should have gotten the Medal of Freedom for what he did, as far as I'm concerned. And so when you go to Canada next time, do I have any Canadians out here? Anybody? Darn, I love Canadians. All right? But think about that. We have differences. We're not always on the same side. But really remember our neighbors to the north, not as a joke, but as real, deep, serious, and loyal comrades to the United States. Thank you.
Let me go ahead and echo something that Art said quickly. I always talk to people and I suggest that I want to start a Hate the Canadian campaign. And I always say that because as a covert operative overseas, a lot of times in the Middle East, they think Canada is somewhere north of Europe. And they seem to get a pass. We only have 3 true allies where we share covert information and we will not step on each other when it comes to running operations and operatives. One is Canada, one is England, and one is Australia. That doesn't mean we don't have other allies, we do. But when it comes to true trust, those are our significant allies where we share everything and we're very, very careful not to step on each other. I want to go over 3 things with you real quick. One, address the emotionality. Since, as they mentioned, I was exfiltrated once from a country in South America and once from a country in Africa. I was also in Mogadishu when we bombed Tripoli, and we had to sequester ourselves in the embassy, and I was under a legend, which means a different name, a different background, and it was very concerning. No one at the embassy knew my real name. And we were locked up there. We had to go out and get some Americans from the hotel and bring them in. So the emotionality that you're seeing and that this movie produced, very real, very real. I'm going to address where real ended and Hollywood began for you, but the emotions, trust me, everything that you saw there, they dream of. Everything that you felt, that they felt. It may not have happened quite that way because we were lucky, but they certainly felt it. So first, I wanted you to recognize that, and again, Canada did not get enough credit. They should have been given more credit. They've been very, very, very respectful of this movie and the effort and the history, but they really did stand up. So second, there's a couple rules with exfiltrations, having been out there, and I've been involved in exfiltrations on the validity of the mission and the veracity of the information leading up to it. That was always the side that I was. But with exfiltrations from the Soviet Union and China and some other countries where we were usually getting out foreign nationals that had allied themselves with us and had helped us, there are a few rules. One is we generally stay very far away from non-government organizations, Doctors Without Borders, Peace Corps, things like this. We don't want those people put at risk because of an operation that we put forward. We stay away from media, and they had mentioned this in the movie. We don't want to represent ourselves as media because, again, it puts the reporters and the people out there doing that work at risk. We also stay away from religion, any religion, for the same exact reason. So it limits some of the things that you can do, and the reason I can share this all with you is we want people to know we stay away from those things. We don't want those folks put at risk. They're out there doing important work, and so we state that very clearly. The other thing, and I think they made it pretty clear in this movie, we want to be benign. We want to blend. We certainly don't want something that's going to bring us to the fore and have people want to line up and take photographs with us. That's what made this so exceptional, because the premise of this movie happened. Doing a movie production, a fake movie production, and trying to exfiltrate, extract American citizens from a foreign country comes with great risk, and it also is rather flamboyant. Not something we would ordinarily do. So those are some things that are exceptions. The other thing, as a rule, we won't be with them at point of extraction. We'll prep them, we'll prepare them, we'll get the documents, we'll make sure everything is ready. But generally, we're talking about foreign nationals, and at point of extraction, they make that pass more times than not on their own. We're ready to receive them on the other side. With Americans, we go to extraordinary measures, and we certainly did in this instance. So with that, let me run you through a few facts. If I forget some and they're of interest to you, ask the questions. As you know, the embassy was absolutely overrun. As you saw, they used some raw footage. There were 66 Americans in the embassy at the time. These, after a very short amount of time, they released 5 women and 13 African-American males. A lot of speculation as to why they did that. They thought it might garner some support for them and divide our country in some way because, of course, we had unified under this attack and under the hostage, or behind the hostages. They still retained 1 African-American male and 2 women. So of the remaining 52. So at the time there were 53. So they released 13 and there was 53. 1 was released that following July and he was very ill. It turned out that he had multiple sclerosis and later died. But he was released and brought back for medical care. So that left the remaining 52. The 6 that left, there were actually 2 groups. One that headed out with Mr. Moorfield, who was the Consular General, significant position. He went one direction, and Bob Andrews took the 2 married folks, the young folks, with him in a different direction. They headed to the British Embassy. Unfortunately for Mr. Moorfield's group, he took a wrong turn and was shoveled back into the compound and captured. So he was part of the hostages. The 5 that headed to the British Embassy, there was a huge crowd out in front of the British Embassy, so they turned around and they actually went to Bob Andrews' house. And they stayed, his residence was close, they stayed there. They shuffled around. They also stayed, so some of the facts, they stayed at the British residence for a while in the compound there. And they moved from house to house for about 6 days before they ended up at the Canadian Well, actually, it was John Shearden, who was a very, very good friend of Bob Andrews, and they ended up at his residence, which was a large compound. When they arrived there, the Canadian ambassador was there to greet him, and was very, very open, just like Art said. Very, very open and very welcoming. So the other person hid out for a while. Our agricultural friend here hid out for a while. He was in a building across the street, left unattended, and actually went and stayed with at the Swedish compound for about several days. Ended up 10 days later being joined in with the 6. Now the Staffords, the young couple, stayed with the Canadian ambassador and his wife. They graciously kept them there. The other 4 stayed with John Shearden on the compound. They could go outside, but they were fearful. They played a lot of Scrabble and cards and had drinks and did a lot of cooking. But there is a concern, as both of our other speakers can attest. Overseas, we need the services of what we call FSNs, Foreign Service Nationals. We don't have the resources for guards and drivers and gardeners and on and on. So we do use Foreign Service Nationals, and there is a level of trust, also a level of exploitation by the countries. So there was a constant risk that they would be found out, and a huge gamble to the Canadians. Now, other embassy personnel from other countries were also involved, did come and visit, were aware, and protected our 6. So it was truly an international effort, and it was done very, very well. So as it went on, they were there 79 days. The Argo was put forward. The Canadian they had 2 issues. One was they had a humanitarian exception to their law where they could provide passports for humanitarian reasons. They would not give the 2. As you saw, Tony Mendez with Ben Affleck traveled over. He met someone in Europe, and 2 of them went in to assist with this exfiltration. So there were 2 Americans there. So as it went on from there, as you saw, fortunately for us, they did train them there, they moved them through, and there were no incidents at the airport at all. They were able to go through the airport, walk out, get on the plane. There was about a 60-minute mechanical delay, and then they were able to fly out. So because of good preparation and because of the help of the Canadians, we were able to assist, and everybody flew out together. So if you have any questions from there, I think that gives you a pretty fair background, but the operation went very smoothly, and fortunately for all of us, they came home, and yes, Canada was not only given the credit, but deserved the credit.
Thank you, Dave. Let's open the floor a little bit for your questions so that you can have a chance to sort of query us as to what your interests are or a little bit about the film. So, anybody out there?
I need an Intel student. Where's my case? Let's go. Somebody ask a question. Break the ice here.
The time frame of the movie, from the time that he started prepping for the fake movie to the time he was actually on the ground in Iran, how accurate was that to
Very
think
accurate,
about?
about 10 days. So we did have contact in Hollywood, but it was very superficial. They actually gave it a little bit more credence than it deserved. But it was superficial. I have never had a foreign officer, knock on wood, call home to check phone numbers, but they are backstopped, and we do have numbers, and we do have offices where phones can be answered. But it's very short term.
What was the reason Swissair was involved to pick these people up? Swissair.
Did you hear that? The question back there? The question was, why was Swiss Air involved?
And I have a very simple answer. They were the most efficient with the fewest mechanical failures. And they still had an hour delay for mechanics. But that's why they were chosen. They were very efficient, they were on time, and it removed us. The 2 folks that didn't have Canadian passports did have foreign passports. So we removed America from the picture. And there was no bazaar. They did not go to the bazaar. As they said in the movie, you wouldn't overexpose these folks. That would be tremendous. There was a bizarre suggestion for the filming, but of course they didn't go there.
Was there any retaliation by Iran against Canada or anyone else?
Those damn Canadians. They never get the blame. So, no, unfortunately there was not. They did close down the embassy for a period of time, I believe. But no, fortunately there was not, because they took great risk. And remember, had these folks, although they walked right through the airport, on false passports from another country, It's hard to argue you're not involved in espionage. With false names, false passports, it would have been a huge embarrassment for the Canadians, but huge risk to the folks traveling out. So, scary moment. Scary moment.
So right near the end of the film, right before they're about to leave Iran, Tim Mendes gets called back home from Langley and the operation was canceled. That never happened in real life. That was kind of just drama.
I can answer this for Art, Jim, and myself. If we're called and told to shut down, you shut down. And of course, they already had the air tickets confirmed and ready to go. You wouldn't be waiting in 1979. You'd have them in hand. But you're told to shut down. That would have been his last mission. So no, there was a delay in Canada from President Carter. It did go to his level, and he did approve it. There was a 30-minute delay, and they've never really discussed why, going over some of the final details before they left Canada for Europe, before Mendes left Canada for Europe. But that was the only delay.
How was this received when it was revealed that it was a CIA operation?
1997.
I don't think there was any real response at this time. CIA is not looked favorably upon, not only around the world, sometimes here. As Art knows, they're out. Very few people in the embassies around the world have diplomatic immunity. CIA doesn't exist overseas, so we rarely, if ever, sometimes we'll be in a position where we can garner diplomatic immunity, but very few do. So the rest of all of the Americans there are at a certain amount of risk. But the diplomats with the State Department do overt and get information from countries as they volunteer it and as they ascertain it. And we go behind the scenes to encourage them to give us information to verify that and validate it so we can corroborate each other. That's the idea. But, could we be looked on any worse?
They call it clandestine service for a reason.
President, as you saw in the credits, or maybe if you missed it, President Clinton declassified the operation in 1997. So you're talking about 18 years after the event, or close to it, about 17 and a half. Then there's a reason for that too. I don't know whether you remember, but in the late 80s, we had a frigate in the Gulf called the Vincennes. It shot down an Iranian airliner by mistake and killed almost 300 Iranian citizens. The captain of that ship's wife was retaliated against in Los Angeles. Her car was actually bombed. And so there's a sensitivity in and around anything associated with whoever might be involved in an Iranian operation. In this case, Mendes had a family, and there were other people involved as well. So classification of an operation over a good amount of time is very, very important.
And yes, I have personally had awards given and taken away. So that's very real. And it can be very frustrating. And sometimes you're allowed to bring immediate family. Most of the time you're not. So it just depends.
Question in the back.
With you saying, making the comment about, how people are put in danger in your family now, so why at the end of the film would they mention, he's living happily in Maryland? That's kind of a small state.
Well, again, you're talking now 32 years, 33 years, and evidently he has said that he's content to be exposed, and so you see it. Well, of course, the story's out in 97 too, so if they wanted to come after him then, they could.
Yeah, I became an open officer in 1998, and up until that time, there was a certain level of protection. Knock on wood, we have never had the targeting of a United States officer from any of our agencies within the United States, from an outside government, let alone up to this point, an outside organization.
I would say to comment on that. One of the things that I think probably, this was 3 years before I came in the Foreign Service, but I was very aware of what was going on here, is the level of confusion, almost a comic opera cast to this thing. Revolutions are messy, they're not very well organized, you're tearing down one government and replacing it with another. But shortly thereafter, the Iranians got their act together, and they're a very efficient intelligence service. They work very efficiently overseas. The only time I was ever tailed for any reason in my entire overseas career was by Iranians. I notified the local authorities and the tail disappeared. But they were there, they watched, they're clandestine people that work, they're attached to all embassies overseas, and if you're in a country where there's Iranian diplomats, you will encounter them. They're under instructions not to really have much to do with Americans, and if one makes an approach to you, you know that that's an intelligence officer. I think the kind of confused nature that you saw here with lots of people shouting and pushing people and shooting people and all of that, they were in that immediate post-revolutionary period where they were still tracking down the Shah or the Shah's people. And I would not make the mistake of thinking that the Iranian intelligence services are like this today.
They've gotten better, but we wish that we had the level of cooperation that they showed in that movie between, the FBI, the State Department, and the CIA prior to 9/11. So that level of sophistication and collaboration it would be difficult to even have today between the ministry of, with the film and the photos and the connection. Now with computers, we've done much better. Back then, it would have been very difficult. And although this was some believe was our greatest loss of intelligence in our history, actionable intelligence where agents were sought after and killed or captured, that was fairly well protected and disguised within the embassy from all sides, and so those folks were protected. Yes, sir.
Just you made a comment about our relationship with England, Canada, and Australia. You could just comment or your opinion on Israel, where they fit in at that time and through current events today. Because when you hear the media, they talk about them being a big alliance supporter. Any comment?
Yeah, I don't mean to diminish our relationship or alliance with so many countries around the world. One is when it comes to terrorism, governments are a business, and terrorism is bad for business. So they will ally themselves and I think work, steadfastly with us. But when it comes to truly sharing intelligence and sacrificing operations to make sure that we don't offend each other or double the effort, that would be Canada, England, and Australia. But we have so many allies, and Israel has been a solid ally and the only democratic force in the Middle East, which is significant. But we've had our differences, and we've had intelligence efforts and operations going both ways. So there's sometimes lack of trust.
And don't forget, during this period, 1979, Israel was struggling with its own relationships and its own contacts in Iran that they didn't want to expose for a number of reasons. Israel had a very strong relationship prior to the revolution, as late as early 1978, with the Shah and the Sadat. In fact, Israel and Iran were close to being allies with the exchange of arms and intelligence. This all went to naught in about 6 to 9 months. And so Israel was struggling about this time with its own particular exposure, its own particular contact. It was also during this particular time that Sadat was negotiating with Israel on the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. And Israel was weighing where it would stand in the world with a revolutionary Iran, and therefore it had to establish some relationship with its former enemy to its west, Egypt. So Israel was playing a strategic game at the time. It was very interesting. We could talk a long time about it, but at that particular point, they had other things that they were worried about.
Remembering back, I don't remember, but what was the catalyst that they finally, after 444 days, released the hostages?
Shah died.
Yeah, as the negotiations went on in the summer, prior to, that is June, July, August of 1980, this is when the Shah was dying of cancer. He was admitted to the Mayo Clinic in the United States, and that became a cause célèbre. And a reason again to sort of for the Iranian Revolution to say, see, they're up to bad things again. Unfortunately, if you are of the Pahlavi family, the Shah expired soon thereafter. And so the reason for, one of the reasons for negotiation was now moot. So then it became a question of, will you give us back the assets that you sequestered? That is, we had a lot of Iranian gold and money in the United States that we sort of sequestered and they couldn't get at. So one of the negotiating points was, we want that back. And by the way, in addition to our money, we want a public, a very, very comprehensive apology for everything that you've done since 1950. So Carter wasn't going to give the apology, but he did give back some cash at some point. And by December, those negotiations in Algiers were complete. And most of the heavy lifting done by Carter and Vance was never recognized because they were actually released as somebody said in the audience on President Reagan's inauguration that day, January 20th, 21st, 1981.
Carter went over to Algiers to greet them. They went through Algiers as a thank you. The Algiers Accord, Jim covered most of it. That bit of cash, I think, was $8 billion. Yeah. So it was a chunk of change that we had frozen. So, please.
Why didn't they kill anybody? Why didn't they kill any American hostage while they had them?
It would have changed the entire dynamic, and they kept threatening to prosecute them for espionage. But had the Marines killed someone coming over that wall, or had they killed a hostage, these gentlemen can speak to it as well. We've got a very, very different situation, and that's not something now that you can sit down and negotiate. They wanted the return of Shah. They were arguing for that. They were threatening to kill them. But to actually put them on trial after you go and storm, remember, a United States embassy overseas, and Art can speak to this, that is U.S. territory. You have just invaded our country and taken our people hostage. A very dangerous thing for any burgeoning regime to do if they want to be recognized by the world. And then if you're going to kill them, that would be unforgivable.
And remember the guy in charge, in this case the Ayatollah Khomeini, had to play the strategic game too, which was the last thing he needed was to alienate another part of Europe and North Africa, which was to say if hostages were killed on his watch, he may lose some political capital there. The other thing was he needed allies in his fight against Iraq. Iraq had invaded Iran in September 1980. He was now in a full-scale World War I type engagement with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So he was fighting a war at the same time that these hostages were imprisoned in the embassy. So a lot of stuff that he had to say, and I would suspect as years go by and some of this is known, that he probably said to the leaders of that particular movement, make sure nobody dies on your watch. One more question?
You know, the scene at the airport, when the group of Americans, they pass their soldiers and then they are forced into the room and then they were violation of the man who talk everything about the film to persuade the soldier. Did that happen? Did that
No.
really happen? No.
They walked right through the airport. They, again, the Canadians and the ambassador had sent envoys back and forth through the airport to help us because Americans traveling in and out, although we had some, was more difficult. So they had checked and rechecked. Now, as far as the taking off the one sheet and leaving the other sheet, a lot of countries did that during that time, and a lot of countries in Africa. But it was usually checked and compared later to make sure that the visas were accurate. It was very difficult for them to do it real time in a busy airport. So that was a concern. The visa was a concern. We had a date wrong. They had the Persian calendar wrong initially, so that was caught, and some adjustments were made to the visa stamps. So it was a tremendous risk and certainly frightening walking through there. But fortunately, the Bob Anders was very flamboyant. Put his hair up. They really took on the characters, and they walked through like crazy Hollywood people and passed right through. They really didn't pay them much attention. Knock on wood. They also went there. They took the earliest flight of the day, and as you saw here, played by Ben Affleck, he arrived very early. He arrived at the airport 5:30, and everyone else came a little bit later, so he could kind of make sure he got through and they could see him when they arrived. And his associate brought them in a Canadian embassy vehicle. the Canadian ambassador, they had said they had asked him for permission to go out into Iran, and he had refused them. And that created the involvement with the ambassador and why he would be there and they would be visiting his house. So they had a pretty good cover story. Still great risk. Great risk.
Yeah, I have just one issue with the portrayal of the State Department people. Right? The kind of dithering, panicky attitude that sort of was a trope there in the initial scene. I've been in some of these situations, certainly nothing akin to this. As in most situations where you're under duress and stress, you react and you go into stress mode doing these kinds of things. We're highly trained professionals, and I'm joking a little bit, but we are. We know exactly what we have to do in these situations. We practice over and over again, largely because of this. Every embassy has an emergency action committee. You know your place, you know what you're supposed to do. People know where they're supposed to go, what their duties are. One of the things we also learned from this was the burn time. When he said burn everything. When the USS Cole was bombed in Aden, in Yemen, we were ordered in Saudi Arabia to burn everything we had. And burn time was supposed to be 15 minutes. That if somebody came over the wall, we were to destroy every bit of classified material and every bit of classified equipment and do it in 15 minutes. And we did. We burned everything we had, all of our records that had any kind of classification at all. So we do learn from these kinds of things to not keep a lot of classified material. But when I first came in, I was a consular officer. When I first came into the Foreign Service, we had a drill exactly what he did to smash the visa plates, which I thought was great. It's exactly that. Was very accurate. You smash stuff. You know, if you couldn't ship it out, you smashed it and broke it. All the equipment, all the computers, all the communications equipment was all smashed. A lot of it had self-destruct stuff on it. I didn't know anything about that because that was the communicators that did all that. But once again, from this incident, we did learn a lot about keeping too much classified material, too much, and restricting things a great deal after the experiences here. They brought in to train new procedures.
We got one question left, I think, because we're getting a high sign.
Did they really use children and others to piece together all those shredded documents to get the pictures?
Yes, but they, again, we consider this one of the greatest losses of intelligence, but that loss concerned methodology, our relationships with Israel and other countries, our international strategy at the time. But as far as actionable intelligence, as Art pointed out, was very quickly destroyed and would have cover layers involved in it anyways. So yes, they actually leafed it together, and you can buy it now. It's for sale. You can get it out of England, I think, and they have some multiple. You can Google it and see it. They put it together because the shredder was outdated. They couldn't burn it in time because we don't literally burn because of the environment anymore, but they mulch it and do a lot of different things. So the shredders are better now, but they weren't very good, and they were jamming as much as they could through there. So yeah, they actually used carpet weavers.
So just real quick, because of the half question. Did they actually know who they were looking for?
Thank goodness, absolutely not. I mean, it could have happened by some fluke, but to put together, as Art pointed out, in that dynamic situation, which personnel were left behind and which weren't, and it was down to a skeleton crew, and you're not going to have a bulletin board with those folks up there. It would have been a very difficult task with the best of intelligence, and this was dramatic. Yeah, no. Thank goodness, no. So that was dramatic effect. Again, I'm sure they felt it, but it didn't happen.
We're getting high.
Well, thanks very much for the evening. Argo.